was city manager.
Police chief,
Good.
fire chief.
This was,
Very good.
I walk about 5 blocks.
is that your go-to?
Congratulations.
Everybody ride a bike or.
Very nice.
She was
I can't cross my legs and fit underneath. Drives me bonkers.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. Yeah. I think we saved, my assistant and I saved $40,000 a year.
I really like this.
Wow. Isn't that nice? Yeah.
This was your show?
One of the big outside planes.
Yeah.
But thanks
A
for
lot of
sharing.
the northeast.
I got a 60
Northeast corner
one of those that's really full.
Ninth and
Filled.
we can't. 888 locks. The 888 locks.
Gary.
Dude, you can
Gary
look at all
Beaker,
the
he was probably-
Final Friday.
Yeah, yep.
So we have a gallery component there, so we're open every Final Friday. We got rotating art from the art center.
Daniel
So
drops
fun little space.
Scott, are we, do we know of people?
Patrick, he will not attend, stuck in Denver, plane cancellation.
Did you get a confirmation from?
Well, do you feel like we can?
I know Bill is
We may want to wait just a few minutes
Oh, is
to
Bill
see.
here?
He's in the building.
Oh,
I
okay.
saw him walk in.
Okay. All right, we'll talk amongst yourselves.
Because
We'll wait for Bill to get here and get stuff. Thank you, by the way, for printing this out. That's,
Yeah, this is huge.
yeah, it's literally huge. Thank you for readable print.
our original plan for straining your eyes past the point of no return. I think we're just need a vote on it.
You know, when we started this, I could read small print.
This way it only gets better.
Here he is. All right, well, I think we should go ahead and get started. Maybe the PR will join us in a bit. But I want to say hello. Here we are for hopefully maybe the last set of meetings to get this work product out to the public. We have a few more meetings to go, and then hopefully we'll bump it out and let the community work on it in public meetings. But welcome back, everybody. We have new faces. 3 of our 4 new appointees are here. So in some ways, we kind of just need to go around the table, I think, and do some introductions so we're not feeling like strangers. The good news is that we started this review of staff's work with some of the more accessible chapters, so we'll get our feet under us a little bit, and then by the time we get to some of the more dense and difficult work, hopefully we'll have some rhythm and a sense of better sense of what we're doing as kind of an almost half new board again. So let's go ahead and make introductions, and Vice Mayor Larson, we'll let you.
I'm Lisa Larson with the Morris City Commission. I'm really looking forward to this, the last 3 meetings, I guess. So this is quite the, I'm just overwhelmed, to be honest with you, looking at this, as I've been looking at this for the past couple of weeks, but it is an honor to be here, and I look forward to what we've got left to do. Thanks.
I'm Karen Willey. I'm with the Planning Commission, one of the county representatives. I'm a farmer, part-time or a volunteer firefighter, former manufacturing business owner, so wearing a lot of hats.
I'm Lisa Harris. I used to be on the Planning Commission and the MPO Policy Board, and I'm representing the county in this process.
Bill Hackley, I'm a city at large, appointed to the commission. Pardon me, the Army civilian, I worked for Leavenworth Strategic Communications and Public Affairs for a little while yet.
I'm Scott McCullough. Along with Amy Miller and Jeff Crick, we are the staff liaison team to this effort.
I'm Scott Zaremba, and I was brought to the table by Jim Flory as business county.
And I'm Jean Milstead. I had the privilege of chairing the steering committee for Horizon 2020, which was a 6-year job. And it was really interesting. I think we had more than 4,000 citizens involved, and they were allowed to determine and sign up for the committee and the issues that they wanted to be involved in, and did. And of course, the land use committee was the largest one and took the longest to make their decisions and recommendations. I've been a banker for 40 years and am now retired and enjoying it very much, and appreciate the invitation to join you.
I'm John Gascon. I'm a financial advisor here in town. I both live and work in East Lawrence now. I relocated my office from Topeka. I spent 10 years in Seattle as a commercial architect and did a number of years with the Logan Housing Institute. And I also serve on the Board of Zoning Appeals.
And I'm Nancy Feldman. I'm Douglas County Commissioner, and happy to be at what I'm hoping is the last phase of this process. Anxious for it to be out in the public's hands so we can really see a final product within my lifetime. And when this all started, I think our hope was to come up with a comprehensive plan that was accessible to the public, that was web-based, that had interactive current maps, that had consistent and readable language, and was visually pleasing, I think I have learned in the process that it is not possible to do all that and have poetic, really prose and lovely language, but we're not far from having a very readable document that still needs to act as a strong guide. So I just want to say we owe the staff a tremendous debt of gratitude for all the work that's gone into it so far, and hopefully we can really move the process along in these last few reviews. Other note, just bookkeeping note, the next meeting in this place starts at 6, so I would like for us to adjourn by 5:45, so there's a way to transition to the next meeting. And Scott, do you need to briefly, so with our new members, talk briefly about the issue of communication and kind of limits on our emails with each other and stuff?
Sure, just in terms of some of the Kansas Open Meeting Act laws and things, we try to stress that you not speak, and some of you, Karen and others, get this training, and Jean may remember it, but we have to conduct our business as a quorum and not communicate directly one-on-one too much or at all, or we stand the risk of breaking some of the open meeting laws. These are legislative actions, and so you can speak to people outside of this committee about their opinions and bring that perspective with you to the table. But if you have questions about conflicts or ex parte communications or meeting outside with others of the committee, please just get a hold of me, and we'll get with the city attorney's office or the county counselor and talk it through.
Thanks. So let's go ahead and move to our agenda. We have some meeting notes that need to be reviewed and approved, hopefully. So has everyone had a chance to read them? So if someone would like to make a motion.
I'll move to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, moved and seconded to approve the meeting notes from November 27th, 2017. All in favor say aye. Opposed? Okay. Thank you very much.
Any abstentions, Chair? I think
Oh, sorry.
At least one. And for the record, Jean is not formally been appointed, but is anticipated to be appointed, but we invited her to the table to
Right.
participate in the dialogue anyway, so
That'll happen this will get done.
just wanted to be clear.
Tuesday and Wednesday. Thanks. So I would guess that Scott, you probably want to review the second item on our agenda.
Sure, just a few things of note. For the new members, and maybe a reminder to the whole committee, just about how we started, what we've done from the point of beginning to now. We started this effort under the pretense that Horizon 2020 is a living document that, Madam Chair, would you like to quickly?
GR, right?
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Sorry I'm late.
Everybody. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I'd be happy to. So I'm GR Gordon Ross on the school board, newly elected last November, started to serve in January, and so was appointed to serve on this committee to represent the school district. So I apologize that I was late. I had a work issue that I had to take care of real quick. So.
No problem.
Okay.
And we welcome you. GR, I'm Scott McCullough, the staff liaison. We were just about ready to go in unless you wanted to go around again quickly, but.
I'll figure it out. It's fine.
Okay, great. Well, welcome, GR. The school district has been an important part of this whole process, so glad we had these filled. And by the way, we did fill, it may seem odd to some that we brought on so many new members right at the end, but it was an important enough ending from our perspective where we're actually looking at what we hope is a final draft of review for this committee, because one of your charges in the joint city-county resolution is to pass on to your satisfaction the document to the formal process of the Planning Commission, City Commission, and County Commission. So again, we started with the pretense that Horizon 2020 is serving us well. and that many of its components would drift over into this plan. In fact, we debated quite a bit about whether it was a new plan or just tweaking Horizon 2020. I think as we got underway, we felt that it really needed to be a new plan. There were enough changes in what we anticipate the future to look like that we needed to build some new policy with this plan. So we actually started just over 4 years ago. And in the resolution, it said your duty was to stop in April of 2015. So I don't know what's taking you so long, but we need to press the gas pedal down. But no, we really did get this committee together in February of 2014. And just a few highlights of the public participation that this committee guided us on. We conducted a citizen survey. So if you haven't, I encourage you to go back and maybe look at the first 3 pages of the citizen survey link on our website that talks about the major findings of what the citizens of our community, both city and rural residents, told us and told you about their expectations. Then we went through a phase of bringing in people to the podium and hearing some expert testimony, people who were experts in their field about a range of issues from housing to environment to retail markets, etc. That took us to the drafting of an issue action report that this committee was integral in shaping and recommending to the city and county and planning commission. We took it to each one of those bodies for their acceptance, and that formed the basis of drafting the first draft plan. That took quite a bit of time, and in July of 2017, we brought the first draft plan based on that issue action report to this body. We put it out for public comment. We received public comment and brought it back to this committee in November of last year. The kind of the big question then is what methodology will we use to review and integrate the public comment? And this committee tasked staff with going through point by point, comment by comment, all the comments we received to date and adjusting the plan according to our lens, okay? So that brought us to today's meeting. At the same time in November, the committee said, well, we really want a series of meetings to look at the new plan chapter by chapter. So we determined that it would take at least 3 meetings, and we gave you a scheme of what each of those meetings would look at, which chapters, and we did choose to sort of start with some what we consider to be the lighter chapters first, and then in April we'll hit natural resources and transportation, and also later in April neighborhoods and housing, economic development, and growth and development. And so I do think that's going to be the heavier of the chapters. And so that brought us to today. We wanted to highlight that this second agenda item, reviewing the public comment report and outcomes, I think what we provided you here, and again, many thanks to Jeff for putting all this together, the main architect and author of the plan to date, but we did reconvene our committee and spent 20 staff hours, literal hours, in the room going through every comment. And you can see some of the analysis here that we did 595 changes to the document. So what this reflects is that we took every comment to heart. What we did is we then gave you what the comment was, or who made the comment, what the issue was, what action we took, and we had about 4 or 5 actions that we would choose from whether it existed in the plan, whether it was incorporated into the plan, whether it was outside the plan scope, or whether we did not accept the change, and then we tried to give staff comment or reasons to it, not only for your benefit, but for the public commenter's benefit about why we chose the action we chose. So you can see here we did 222 replacements, 199 insertions, 134 deletions, so there's quite a bit of effort there. We found just under 10% of the comments were outside of the plan scope for the recommendations. Greater than 50% were either existing in the plan or incorporated into the plan, and about 38% weren't incorporated for reasons we gave in this document. So one question you might have is, okay, we have changed the document now, we're giving you the public comment, what can you expect to do with it from this point forward? One thing I would recommend is that we do not go through another round of actual public comment on the draft plan, because there will be that opportunity as you give it to the planning commission, city commission, and county commission. I would remind you that all three commissions need to accept or adopt or approve the plan, depending on which state statute language you're looking at, in order for it to be effective for the city, county's land use purposes. But what you do have before you, what I would recommend you do, is you've seen how we have treated all the comments. If there's one that you particularly think need to be in the plan or needs to be adjusted in the plan, over your next series of meetings, I would take that opportunity to direct us to do that, okay? Or have the discussion or note it for the group. So we've provided this to you as a tool to be able to do that with, to look at the comments and say, well, you said you didn't, that it's outside the plan scope. We think it is in the plan scope, and here's why. And we can have those discussions. But at the end of our series of meetings, I would hope that there's been enough public participation, knowing that there is even more public participation, that you feel satisfied enough to send it on for that set of meetings as well. But ultimately, it is up to this committee to steer it in that direction. And so with that, unless there are questions of us, we're here to, as a resource, and the co-chairs can direct whether, what you want to do with item number 2 and 3, whether you want to take them together or look at the public comment and call out anything of importance to you there. So.
Just a clarification question. Did you say that when you recommended not to incorporate something in here, you have an explanation of why?
Yes.
Okay.
There were only a few that the staff action was that it was outside the plan scope, or that that we received the comment because we may not have had a great response to the comment, or it was self-explanatory in the public comment itself.
So it is difficult since there are several new folks here. Well, about half of the folks here are new, so it's difficult without having a deep background and history here to judge whether this is, adequate representation of all the public comment and all the conversations this committee has had with the former membership. But I'm happy to have us entertain any comments, concerns, questions, criticisms, or praise in this moment. We certainly have evidence of an awful lot of staff reflection and work on tons of public input. So does anyone have concern?
I got a question first. Today the intent is to focus on the community resources chapter and the appendix chapter, is that right?
Correct.
Is there any way there's any kind of alignment in these 26 pages with those two chapters?
I would say Jeff and Amy can fill in. First of all, it was difficult. A lot of the comments were, because of the way we've designed the document, there's a lot of policy threads that go throughout different chapters. So I don't know if we can pull out specific community resource and appendix chapter discussions. And I do recall that there was one comment that sort of asked, why are we reiterating all of our action steps in the appendix chapter when it's in the bulk of the plan? And our comment was because it's our tool, our way of monitoring progress throughout the years of implementing the plan. But I think that's also maybe highlights an approach, Bill, that you could take is, as you review the plan, if you've taken some time to go through this, some things might pop out at you.
That almost seems like about the, you know, the
Yeah.
most efficient way to get into the heart of things is to just start talking about the chapters we have assigned to us today. But before we do that, is there anyone who,
I have a question. So when it says that these have been incorporated, that was already part of the existing plan, or that there have been significant changes made to the document from before the public comment?
They incorporated, so if you take on the first page, Marvin Hunt's comment about Peaslee Tech, we incorporated that comment or recommendation and see sidebar on page 50. So sometimes we incorporated something from our perspective, may not necessarily have been the perspective of the commenter, may not have gone far enough, or may have been a different way to do it. So again, part of why we put this out here is for the commenters, the public, to see it, to go specifically to where we may have made a change, and through our public process, hopefully later in the process, they can come and say, staff completely missed the mark, or staff hit a home run with how they interpreted our comment. Does that answer the question?
So will this be a public document? Does the public have access to how we interpreted this, and then they can have
Oh yeah, it's,
access?
it's already posted onto
Okay.
the website.
so if it's been incorporated, that means it's a change that you took from the comments
That
of the
means it-
public, and you've changed the draft plan to reflect that.
It wasn't in the plan,
Right.
but it is now. Sometimes it was in the plan, but we deleted it, so we incorporated the recommendation. If it is existing in the plan, we know it is existing in some, if it's capturing the intent of that comment.
So under listed attachments on the agenda where it says red line draft plan,
Yes,
does that mean that items on the 26 pages that were incorporated should be reflected in that red line draft plan?
correct. So all of those replacements, insertions, or deletions, you want to bring up a page of the red line plan? It's really difficult to read that plan, that's why we gave you the
I
clean
know that.
version.
I know that.
But this data reflects that red line plan. And sometimes we were looking at sort of rewrites of a theme, or especially in the growth and development chapter, you'll see that we really try to enhance some of that language. So it got pretty messy pretty quick.
I have a question, getting back to my original question, just to try to follow this. So on page 6, we have at the bottom of the page, we have the start of comments from Mary Miller.
Right,
And those continue on page 7,
correct,
and then continue on page 8 and 9.
correct.
And then we've got on page 8 and 9, we have things that were not incorporated, and there are no comments from staff about why.
Yeah, and a few of these, with Mary's in particular, we just determined that we wouldn't incorporate them, and we could speak to it here in the meeting. And for those who don't know, Mary Miller's on our planning staff,
Right.
so she's not a public commenter that we felt needed to see all of the justification like somebody in the public would.
I personally feel
Yeah.
like if she took the time to comment on this, I'd like to know why you felt her ideas were not worth incorporating.
It would seem that the public would want to know that too.
Yeah, and we can go back and do that if you like. We were trying to make some deadlines and we could pack it out.
And frankly, many of her comments and perspectives that I also share, and were things that I had flagged on my own before I went through the public comment.
Yeah, and you can see many of them we did incorporate there, because there were some other members who shared that view. We did too. Mary did a great job in reviewing it from a from a current planner's perspective. So we really appreciated those comments.
Specifically, if we're getting specific, the lack of an agricultural section is kind of glaring, I think, in the plan. And Mary does flag that out, because we dance around it in so many places. We talk about open space, we talk about prime soils, we talk about the local food systems, but we don't really, and it could either go under maybe this community resources, which is what we're going to talk about today, or we also have, commercial, industrial, employment-related, and agriculture is missing from that section also. In one of those places, it maybe needs more mention than it has gotten.
So a couple thoughts that we had, again, through our lens, and one of the primary purposes of having a comprehensive plan out of state statute is to build development codes and subdivision regulations off of and all other design guidelines and different things, right? So agricultural use is the one use that's exempt from zoning. So, so every time we talk about putting emphasis on agricultural use, the planner in me has to say, well, that's good to talk through that, and you can see it's a thread throughout this entire document, but from a land use perspective, it's already got a lot of protections in the state statute. So how much weight should we give it in the comp plan from a land use policy guide would be a question I would ask the committee to think about.
And I would counter that it's a land use document, but it's also a visionary document, and it spends a lot of time talking about the things that we value that may or may not be specifically land use things, lots of time with that. And the fact that it doesn't have anything specifically that we value the largest industries, the largest employment segment in the county, and the largest land use segment. We do have a lack of agricultural, and I mean like traditional agricultural infrastructure in the county, and that much of it we had and has gone away. And without a way of really showing that we value that and have a vision for that, it's easy for that to continue to erode.
And I think you'd find that we did enhance a lot of that theme and policy in the draft plan. Again, it's going to take some work to work through all of this and read it and come up with some of the issues that we need to keep working on. And a lot of Mary's comments in particular had us looking at individual policies surrounding rural development, agricultural development. And so take it as a whole, like we did, not just one. Yeah, we pushed back a little bit on an entire section or chapter entitled Ag Preservation and Rural Character because we tried very hard to get a balance of the urban and rural themes throughout every category of chapter that we had. So in other words, we don't have an urban chapter or city chapter. We don't have a rural chapter. We've got it focused in on the land use components of it, the different categories of that, transportation, neighborhoods, growth management. So we could have come at it from a completely different perspective. It would have been easier to do that if we were to look at it, city issues and county issues. But instead we put kind of these threads through all of our different broader categories.
Any other thoughts on that? I think that's a real struggle because we have, our county's actually recognized beyond our own state for its emphasis on different ways of doing agriculture. I mean, having definitely traditional agriculture as one of our largest industries, but also having this really visible dedication to specialty crops and local food production as part of our culture and economy. So I appreciate the desire to pull that out. I do see a lot of that language in threads through the document, but I think it'll be important to be able to hear whether the public calls that out as a missing piece of the plan, and wonder what that would look like. because it is different, it's not vacant land, it is a different vision that maybe could use some clarity, because it comes up over and over and over again. And is a strong community value, so.
I think it's interesting to have a fresh outside perspective on the process. Makes me think about some things differently. I'm persuaded by the argument to have a chapter devoted to agricultural uses and industry. And partly because in a land use plan, it's easy to see land that's not developed with buildings and infrastructure as vacant land, as undeveloped land, and agricultural uses are a use just as much as anything else that we have in the plan.
You're talking about a separate chapter.
The other land uses are sections inside of one chapter. So would you be requesting a separate section or a whole new chapter?
It's probably not a whole chapter, maybe a specific section to it, or just to make sure that the ideas are all addressed, even if that is, incorporated in the other sections.
So you would want the policies that we already have pulled out and put into their own.
I think it probably does need a little bit more language, in terms of that visionary part of how this plan operates, for what we value for our agricultural sector, and including, and it could, like the local foods and that sort of thing could fall under that chapter, under that heading, for whatever that would be, because we do have a whole section on local foods, which is fabulous, but that's one segment of an industry that isn't specifically mentioned.
The food policy?
We don't, with the Food Policy Council, we have local food spelled out in here. It has, historic resources, parks and open space, and, and local foods is one of those sections. And it talks about agriculture's role in the community, but it doesn't talk about all segments of agriculture. It just talks about the local food. It doesn't talk about community or commodity agriculture, which is still the largest land use in the county.
Do you see development, future development and expanding development on the city boundaries as directed agricultural land?
The city boundary itself, not as much as the breakup of agriculturally useful farmsteads into more rural residences that are not used for agriculture. And that's not even necessarily by size, because you can use 5 acres or 1 acre excellently well for agricultural purposes, but many of them are not. They become the ranchettes that then become outside of agricultural production completely. That's, I think, more of a threat.
To give you an example, on page 11 of your, Mary had a good comment about the economic development chapter, mentioning some of the rural ag development. And so we incorporated a policy for ag and rural business policy, created 4.6 of that chapter. So that's when I talk about the theme of different land use categories, where they fit in this construct of our plan, that's what I'm talking about. So when we're talking about economic development, there was a weakness here in terms of ag's not represented enough, so we went in and bolstered that component of it.
But is your comment maybe, well, it's great to have those threads throughout the plan, but maybe it deserves a section where it's all said in one place in a cohesive message that sets out values and visions around that particular.
That's certainly something that I would look for, but I'm not trying to dictate how the process is run, just throwing it out for consideration for other members.
Scott, do you recall the size and acreage of tier 1 or tier 2 and tier 3 development as it's planned forward, like as an order of magnitude? how many acres we're talking about expanding into?
Yeah, was it about 8 square miles, tier 2? Seems like that number sticks in my head. And we're here to take your direction. I guess I would just ask, are other components needing in hand? If we're going to emphasize ag, should we be emphasizing expanding the urban environmental fabric of the cities in the county to match that, to give it balance? Or is it unbalanced now? When you look at the document as a whole, does agriculture need to be greater emphasized? That's what I'm hearing. And we can do that. We can do that to whatever satisfaction that you want. But we're kind of getting down to the specifics. Trust me, we tried to balance building a document by a committee of what is hundreds of people, if not thousands. We're not sure who's all working on this outside of the organizations who are getting together to work on this and provide their comments. So when you push this way, some organization wants you to pull it this way. So food policy, for example, has been worked over with that group to kind of weigh their needs versus our land use perspective. So
Tier 2 is 8.5 square miles.
For tier 2?
how many?
8.5 square miles.
8.5 square miles.
I'm just curious what you think about, being new to this group, how you think about, do the math really quick. 5,400 acres lost.
Well, the city still has to grow. I mean, balancing that, then I just, and the wiser we can grow, the better. And I think that this really does provide for quite a lot of that. So I don't really expect, trying to emphasize infill, and I think that's fabulous. And we've got these tiers, which I think are probably pretty reasonable. That would be, to push back against that, I think is probably more than realistic as far as, so, no, I don't really like that we would lose those acreages to agricultural production, but we've also incorporated potential for urban ag, in the last few years. So it doesn't necessarily mean that people who could not provide for some agricultural production on their own scale within those tiers. That bothers me less than, what I see as the breaking up of tracts that can be used for agriculture into things that are still rural residences, but not in the city, but not actually available anymore for a great deal of production.
And this is typically unincorporated.
Mhm.
And when we do the tier 2 calculation, that's presuming City of Lawrence, correct?
Correct.
The reason I bring that up is I think there's kind of a domino effect of that tier 2 expansion, is that there's a desire for people to live a kind of semi-rural lifestyle,
We have a lot of that.
which could push that demand even higher as we absorb all that tier 2.
I think even more than that, and I'm a fan of infill, but the more we ask for infill, especially in residences, is, people say, well, I want a bigger yard than that, so I will get 3 acres or 5 acres or 20 acres in the country instead. So it does have an impact on that, but I don't see a clear policy that would be better.
Yeah, I think it just raises the issue for me of understanding the pros and cons, or at least explaining or exploring how to explain to the public that these are trade-offs that we're making. And I brought an example that I'll show later that kind of talks about that.
Well, recall, the primary reason for doing this is planning how to accommodate a growth trend that we assume will keep going, right? And so if our growth is at 1.2% per year, we need to accommodate that. And this is the plan that will do that for the next 12 years till 2040 based on all of our data. And it does emphasize infill development, but it also appreciates and acknowledges that growth is going to be necessary because we don't have a lot of infill, as much infill potential as we need to accommodate the growth that's expected to come to the community.
I don't know if I agree with that statement. It just means that people are uncomfortable with that info. We absolutely have the land to put 30,000 people in the existing city boundaries. That's a non-issue. The issue is whether or not the public will accept it.
Is the question of kind of rural development, housing, rural subdivisions going? Is that more an issue of county regulations and county policy that?
I think it's both. It gets set up in the comp plan, and then we would, adjust our subdivision regs primarily to meet the policy statement.
I've been out of this for quite a while, and I need some clarification about the 10-acre exemption that used to be in place where people had to buy a minimum of 10 acres in order to be able to build in the county, and they needed rural water meters. Is that still the case?
The codes have changed a
Okay.
little bit, and there are still ways to develop the property and get these rural estates that may or may not harm the agricultural industry. And I can't summarize the details of that, but I think the issue with ag, as I've experienced it, is again, it has protections in state statute. And so where a lot of times what you're doing with your comprehensive plan is looking at the things you want to do to guide growth a certain way or get certain policies that aren't governed by the state statute. Agriculture has the greatest protection of all. A lot of times it's fighting to maintain it so that it doesn't become the farmer's 401k and sell off, and that's what we're seeing threaten agriculture. It's not ag itself. There's nothing we can do to ag as a government that can harm it, except maybe create policies and codes that allow it to go away into the rural residential arena. And so, yes, there is some ability to do that and to reduce the size of farm ground.
Well, I've been monitoring the real estate transfers for the last year and a half for United Way to increase their mailing list so that everybody has the opportunity to be asked to donate. And there are a huge number of sales that just list vacant land in the real estate transfers every week.
See that?
But not all of that is by growth from new people moving into our community. It's people making a lifestyle change within the community. So it's not all going to depend on growth.
Sure.
And somehow or another, we need to factor that into this plan. And maybe it's through the county rules and regs, I don't know.
And we're going to have a very healthy discussion on growth management on that
Yeah,
April
sure.
16th date. But
Well, how do we want to proceed? I mean, is there
well, you might I think this will become something you use through all three of your meetings. And I encourage you to go through it. And again, we can take direction at any one of these meetings if you want to come to issues. But I do encourage you to look at it in the context of the whole plan and what we've tried to do there.
and set out there that the one possible solution to the sense that there's not a cohesive section that describes, that puts all those threads together in one place in a narrative that speaks to the agricultural industry in our community in all its various forms. We don't have that one place, and so one solution might be to add a section that gives that narrative, and then those threads are pulled out throughout. Because there's a lot of agricultural language throughout the document. But there isn't one place where it all comes together.
Right, and I would certainly be happy to, as we look through the rest of the things that are on the agenda for this meeting, and just kind of keep that in mind as something, as we look at it in terms of balance, if that still seems to be something that is missing to more than just me. And just kind of work through the rest of it and then come back to that at some point.
You have an idea where you want that where that would go in the document?
The possibility, probably with where the local food section is now in community resources would be my first choice, but there are other places too, I'm sure. Economics or anyone.
Okay, well, let's set that aside and see how the conversation goes this week. Unless anyone has any other comments to make, we have a good bit of work to do, reviewing the community resources chapter and seeing how that reads. Is there anything else anyone wants to cover before we move on to that?
Did we solicit, or were these just general comments that came out? I mean, did we solicit organizations to make the comments, or
No, these were comments based on the first draft plan that went out for public.
it just came back from the?
And it was advertised quite a bit. I mean, there was.
Well, I just don't know if we solicited or not, because I looked at some of those and they're very extensive. It's like-
Yeah. No, I think it had a really good, there was really good participation, I think. So let's go ahead and get to reviewing that community resources chapter. So we can, there's about an hour left for discussion of these two items.
We need to take public comment today.
Madam Chair, we didn't set it up. The public comment you have is in your packet from the first plan, and we set this series of meetings up for this committee to take into account the public comment, the draft plan, give us direction, knowing that there'll be additional public comment once you send it to the Planning Commission, City Commission, and County Commission. You will have a decision to make after this series of meetings on where to go from here with the plan. You know, if we're looking at rewriting kind of some more sections or adding sections, which is fully within the purview of that, and getting more public comment, then that's a decision you can make. We didn't set it up just time-wise for the public comment.
This is mostly for us to review the
Exactly.
revision work that you've done to see if we're
Exactly.
meeting the public's expectations on what's already done. So, I think we'll go ahead and move through the rest of this agenda, and then if you don't mind, if you sorry.
Thank you.
So, Scott, how do you want us to,
Well,
you want to lead this?
Yeah, really leave that up to the committee, but starting with community resource, you'll see just our headings of historic resources is the first resource that we look to, and we're really working on a rewrite of this topic in Horizon 2020 anyway, but you'll see that it's my knee just hit. Okay. You'll see that so it's been updated, and another thing to keep in mind is that these policies set up the ability to go through text amendments and do code changes later. So if you see something in there that you're scratching your head about, it may or may not become a code amendment issue to the city commission or county commission. So our main topics in this chapter are historic resources, Parks, Rec, and Open Space, which has its own master plan, community facilities, arts and culture, food systems development. So these are resources of the community. So we could have that discussion about agriculture, whether that's a private resource or a community resource, or some combination of the two. In most instances, it's a land use held by private entities, private interests. So we focused on this, in this chapter, on kind of those assets that were valued by the entire community. Historic resources is mostly private interest as well, but it is a policy issue that is considered to be of high value to the community, so we establish policies for it. It doesn't have a standalone plan like Parks and Rec does and like Cultural Arts does today. So those two in particular in the food systems section all have sort of accompanying plans associated with them. And you'll remember that this plan is a little bit different than Horizon 2020 that incorporates by reference a lot of the standalone documents and plans that others in the field, in their respective field, have taken the time to develop for us. So as something comes up in cultural arts or food systems development that has a land use component, we will direct the planning commission and city or county commission to that portion of that plan. A lot of the plans that we incorporate by reference are operational plans, some of them, and not necessarily about development. So that's how we would use those plans in the future.
So do you all want to start at the beginning of chapter 7 and just go page by page, or what's the pleasure of the committee in terms of how we review what we have in front of us and get a sense for the level of satisfaction?
I think that makes sense. And if there's nothing on the page, we can move on.
How do you get it in front of us?
Oh, you can go can you give instructions to GR on, I had it already pulled up on.
To the website?
on the iPad.
Do you have a device there, Julie?
Yeah, I've got it.
Or we
Maybe-
can look on the same.
You can just do do City of Lawrence
Jeff will
comprehensive
come-
plan and pop it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jeff will come around and help you.
Should I get the red line copy?
It has
This is
2018
needs to
draft.
needs to be incorporated. If you have it.
On page 58, item 1.4 under goals, can you just give me an example of a specific land use plan?
Page already. 28.
58,
The latest.
I don't have the latest,
Oh.
sorry.
Awesome.
See where I have it circled?
Thank you.
1 point,
Yeah,
Oh, wait a
so the question is, and it's 1.4 is the item 7A 1.4, integrate historic preservation elements in specific land use and neighborhood plans. So that would be something like the Oria neighborhood plan,
I know the neighborhood, but I don't understand the specific land use.
specific
Or is it
land use
specific
plan.
land use and neighborhood?
Yeah, we have different levels of plans.
Okay,
So we have neighborhood plans or the neighborhood sized
Mhm.
plans. And then something like the Southeast Area Plan that covers a broader,
Okay.
wider range.
So, and if you were looking at the electronic version of this, that specific land use plan is blue and underlined, so you would, it links you to the section that
Okay.
shows various plans, and then you can find the very specific, like the Northeast Sector Plan or the Oria Neighborhood Plan. So that's what's different about this, is it's really meant for people to access it electronically and do lots of linking. So it's a little bit of a disadvantage to folks who aren't doing
That's neat.
web-based stuff. Yeah, no, I mean, that's a,
So when you have something like 1.3 says adopt a comprehensive historic resources preservation plan, is there a time frame for that, or is it just?
So that would go into our appendix chapter, right, where we would be monitoring any action steps here. So no, there's not yet a work plan. So as this gets adopted, our plan would be, every year we produce a planning work plan. And we decide which priorities to take on of the comprehensive plan and of other direction from our commissions, our governing bodies. And so that's a good example of something that, if adopted, would need to get onto a future work plan for consideration by the governing body. Other examples might be build a stream corridor ordinance to buffer the sides of streams, which actually has been in the plan for a long time. But
how's that going?
it's status quo,
So item,
resource challenged.
item 2.2 on page 59 would be the same thing. Create appropriate transition areas between historic district structures. My question is who decides that? So that would be a planning action?
Yeah, so that would be something that could be integrated into one of our sector plans, for example, in terms of thinking about this policy as we're building different land use patterns of a area plan or sector plan.
I have a question. Some of us are working from the original version and some from the draft new version. Could we just walk through the changes that have been made to the new version, or are they so many that you can't do it?
Yeah, we can, let's just bring up the chapter and we'll show you maybe the red line version will show you where the changes were made.
That would be great.
Because depending on the chapter, they were more or less significant. I can't recall in this particular chapter how significant. Is that it? Okay, so, yeah, maybe Jeff can just walk us through what those, you can zoom in a little bit more too.
So it looks like on this page, the real big one was under the advisory boards, the Heritage Conservation Council of Douglas County was moved back to position here. So it bumped down a couple of items. That would be the real big change on page 74.
74?
It must be a different.
64, sorry.
64.
Red line's got 10 pages ahead of it.
Yeah,
I'm
just
reading
got-
wrong. So page 64.
58 for
58 for us. At least I'm not the only.
So is that deleted? Is that what you're saying?
Was added.
Added, okay, so I have the new one, thank you.
So on page, new page, yeah, I'm not sure, 65, which would be item 2.9, existing historic, resources invested in existing structures and sites was added at the end of it.
I can tell you, there wasn't a lot of comment on this chapter.
There wasn't.
One of the reasons we made it one of your first ones, to work out the bugs of how you want to review it.
Good.
I have a question on page 59 where it asks the question, what is a certified local government? And the answer talks about a certified local government program. It needs to say the same thing.
Okay.
what is a certified local government program mean?
I mean,
Sure.
how is a certified local government different than a certified local government program? If there is a difference, then the question needs to be
Well,
changed.
one's a program that sets up being a local
Maintain
government.
certified local government status.
So the certified local government program is a partnership and it establishes a certified local government.
So then should the question be, what makes a certified local government?
Can be.
Do you see what I'm saying? It just,
Sure.
thank you.
Where do you see us?
The sidebar.
It's on the sidebar.
But it refers to.
Way in the bottom of the page.
Yeah.
It
on the right.
refers to item
Yeah, I got it.
111, no?
Different page numbers.
Oh,
I'm probably going to open up a can of worms here, but I have a real issue with this chapter, particularly when we look at number 1.9. And I know that if we look back at historic preservation, there's kind of this 50-year mark that kind of gets followed. And if you look at the goal, it says working to locate and study historic resources is a large undertaking. And then it says ensures these resources are retained for future generations. And I think one of the biggest challenges with historic preservation, or the idea of what a historic resource is it by default assumes that what makes a resource or something historically significant is the thing itself, rather than focusing on the patterns of how and why it was built and the things that it provides. So it's easy to presume that a house in East Lawrence is somehow historically significant because it was built in 1870 or 1890. But often the houses in that neighborhood have no real significance whatsoever. They were only designed to be there for 20 years, 30 years. If development patterns had continued like they had all across this country and really all across the planet, they'd all be 3 or 4 story brownstones by now. The automobile prevented that. But what are some of the unique characteristics of these houses that makes them so special to us today? And oftentimes we think it's simply because they have a certain style to them. But in reality, it's things that are simple, like they have a front porch, and that front porch is 10 feet from the sidewalk, not 25 feet from the sidewalk like houses that are built out in the suburbs. So my big concern here is that we're adding this overlay of historic preservation with this marching 50-year timeline, which means by the time that this next plan is at this stage, that we're talking about preserving houses built in 1995 or 2000, which frankly will never have any historic significance whatsoever because they're built under design patterns that are primarily oriented towards the automobile, when that may not be how we live in 30 or 40 years. And what I fear is that we're going to put a whole nother level of NIMBYism on neighborhoods that frankly shouldn't be saved in 50 years.
And I don't disagree with that perspective, John, but if you read this policy, it's document and evaluate structures for consideration.
I see that.
So for example, we have a grant proposal going to the city commission either tomorrow or the March 20th to study Barker neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And if we get the funding, we would go evaluate Barker neighborhood for consideration as a historic district. It doesn't mean that it's automatic, and this doesn't make it automatic, but this gives us the plan policy to acknowledge that, hey, that 50-year mark is the trigger for having the evaluation of whether or not structures should be considered for their historic value. I agree, not always will they meet that threshold, meet the merits.
Correct me, I know that the heritage, the historic survey of the county, on all 9 townships, they've used that 50-year mark as well. So that's an actual standard of professional historic preservation. That wasn't an arbitrary year that was.
Right, so we're just acknowledging in our plan that that's the mark of when we should do our evaluation and consideration.
The challenge that I have with that, Scott, is that I can see this being weaponized. And the problem is that as neighborhoods get more established, they're occupied by older individuals that have the time, money, and resources to basically protect their own backyard. And that's a threat to younger home buyers or younger potential homeowners who don't have those resources. And ultimately, the trade-off of doing this, and by the way, I have a historic home, so I'm responsible for maintaining it. I'm a steward of that home. And I'm working with St. Luke A.M.E. to help with phase 2 of that restoration. So I believe in historic preservation. But the problem is that this is antithetical to low-income housing. This is antithetical to providing density and long-term solutions to keep housing prices down. And I would like to see much more of an emphasis on 1.5 and 1.6, and much less of an emphasis of things like 1.9. And less of an emphasis on objectivity and more an emphasis on patterns of what makes something historic. Because most people that are responding to these neighborhoods don't realize they're responding to these subtle patterns of how and why those houses were developed, not what they look like.
Which is why we're taking an entire neighborhood worth of study, right?
Mm-hmm.
But from our perspective, how these get rated out is ultimately up to the governing bodies. Right? But the policy support exists. And I don't disagree with you that 1.9 could get very little traction or could be used to put another layer into the development process for every structure that comes in for permit. So it's that balance of what we want to do and looking at it in the context of the chapter that it's in. So there's a presumption that it will be used reasonably, although I'm not discarding the fact that it could be used unreasonably. But
based on then I suggest we strike 1.9.
So that's before the committee.
Strike that one?
1.9. If looking at where we are right now, we're basically talking about homes newer than 1970. and almost all of those were built under a development pattern that serves the car. I find it really hard to believe that we're going to struggle preserving those few homes that really are architecturally significant that were built after 1970. And I'm just concerned about what that could lead to as this chapter starts to apply to these kind of middle ring neighborhoods as people try to entrench themselves, essentially to prevent any type of multifamily, which would lead to the erosion of our agricultural land. This is antithetical to many of the other project chapters, and I think 1.9 is my biggest concern.
I know that, I mean, as they've been doing the historic resources evaluation in the county, and then they've met with each township and, you know, shown their results and everything, that 50-year mark has gotten some chuckles from people as far as that being a historical resource at 50 years old. However, to pull it completely, I think might pull the rug out from under the folks that have been doing those surveys. Now, they're not saying that all these buildings that are 50 years old need to be preserved. That's just kind of, you know, as they do their drive-by, they're finding those structures, and then they're finding the more significant ones that are, you know, within that group that are in context to try and take to the next level. I don't know if pulling it entirely is the right answer, but certainly I think what you're saying is quite true as far as that could lead us on a slope to neighborhoods that don't need to be preserved specifically for their historic value being preserved for other reasons.
Yeah, that's my concern.
Well, and again, because it's a standard we use to evaluate districts, that will remain the standard we use. I mean, if it goes away, we won't stop trying to protect historic assets, because that's a high value.
Right.
It just wouldn't have the highest level of plan support as a policy.
What about striking the 50 years? Document and evaluate historic structures for consideration on historic inventory. Does that address your concern?
It helps. It does help. And somehow emphasizing holistic infill and adaptive reuse of historic structures. Another aspect of this that is a little bit lost as well is that if you look at technological advances as we kind of relate, this is advanced miles ahead of construction technology in the last 30 years. If you look at computer technology, we're just now seeing the integration of technology in construction. I would say that architecture and construction industry is probably about 50 years behind other aspects of things. We're likely to see a much different housing type over the next 30 years during the incorporation of this plan, which means the efficiency of newer houses compared to certainly the houses built in my neighborhood is really going to be ridiculous. They're not even going to be the same thing. And what I've seen happen with these kinds of policies is an attitude of what I call architectural hoarding. So rather than keeping the best and most important structures and examples of that history, and then incorporating the patterns that made those neighborhoods sustainable over long periods of time, what I see is designating every single structure that was built in a certain time period as important, when it simply wasn't. And the problem with that is that those houses tend to be expensive to upkeep and maintain, and they're energy inefficient, which again is antithetical to lowering the cost of housing for all and being a good steward to our environment.
I think it's important to note that the 50-year mark comes in for, when you're talking about CLG status and settlement, that is a threshold set by the Department of Interior and National Park Service. So having that 50-year in there is also a key metric they look at when evaluating grant applications and your CLG status for the city and the county.
That's what I recall the conversation with the county when we became CLG, and it seems strange to be going out, noticing particularly the 50-year mark, but it's a technical expectation in terms of.
So all those points are arguable and have counterpoints to them, and it's not my point to argue the issue, but just to say that you're right. I mean, building codes have advanced.
Yeah.
And building codes address historic structures today. They have to, because the codes change, the technology changes, and they have to work together. But I can see that there's a fear that all of a sudden we're looking at every structure that comes in for permit, goes through some extra 3-week process of review. That's not the intent per se of this. It's to give us the support to go out and evaluate areas for their pattern, because we place such a high value on our history, Lawrence history.
I wonder if it would help to have as part of 1.9 in parentheses or something, that this is a standard set by, that this isn't, somehow make it clear this isn't an arbitrary number that was pulled out of our hat, but that's an actual standard of the State Historic or National Historic Associations related to certified local governments or whatever, so that it's clear that it's not a subjective thing we're throwing out there, but it's part of a technical review expectations. Jeff, you're good at coming up with words. You know words.
Here,
But Scott, you talk about the intent of it, is there a way to find some language that would address that?
Well, and again, every policy here, if implemented in code, would need to go to the governing body for a change in code. So it's the type of policy that we may want to use as we bring forward a funding grant to say, we'd like to study X neighborhood. And by the way, our plan has support for that, because we value historic protection. If we brought you a code that says every building permit goes to HRC for an evaluation of the 50-year mark, which we could do with this policy, but then it would be the governing body to weigh that issue and balance it with the other values that we have.
Yeah, I should rather we didn't.
I mean, we could do that today, right? I mean, we don't need one line of the comp plan to do that, but that's the example of how any one of these policies has a range of application and interpretation, and ultimately it's the governing body that creates that interpretation of it.
to put it another way, this does not welcome infill or multifamily or added density. We don't have any tools in here that are going to encourage that. All I see is tools in here to discourage it.
I disagree with that. So if you look at 1.5 and 1.6, you're talking about adaptive reuse of historic structures.
But most of these structures are houses, and so then you see further on it says to keep the original residential character.
4.6,
So-
1.8.
I don't think it's a Lawrence value to turn over our historic areas with higher density developments, though. I mean, if it were a value, this would read even more differently. But
Well, so
that's-
let's talk about historic values. I mean, my neighborhood had 6 people per household in 1920. Now it has 2.1. We have half or a quarter of the number of people living in East Lawrence than we did 50 or 60 years ago. We can't solve that by saving every one of these boxes and making them for 2 people to live in. We have to figure out creative ways to get more people in the neighborhood. Otherwise, our school goes away.
But what's that a function of? You know, you could, you're arguing it's a function of historic regulations,
Absolutely.
and I don't know that it is.
It absolutely is. We just downzoned one of our neighborhoods.
So we didn't
When
change
is-
any of the development pattern to it.
When are we, just for the sake of making sure we don't narrowly focus on one thing, or we have an entire chapter to work with, actually two. Our conversation about infill development and housing, all of that is going to come in our second next meeting or third?
Third mostly.
Okay. So we can remember this concern that's been well stated, very well stated. And as we talk about infill development, neighborhood, kind of residential.
Maybe Jeff can come up with some alternatives to look at what we're doing. And some wording that can help keep that, because, I mean, I agree with him. I mean, come from the business side of it, we talk about that, you put 50 year, and all of a sudden, that's a Pandora's box. I mean, I purchased a historic structure, and there was enough value in that historic structure, we didn't tear it down. but it has to have something that's functional and not just every box that's on the corner. And how do we determine that and keep that in play? Because, you know, we have affordable housing on one side and then want to keep every house in town that's not efficient, not functioning, and not in the realm that we're trying to get to. And so, I mean, there's a slippery slope
Super
there.
expensive to our city.
I think
It's
if you,
important,
if
but
you
it's
review-
very, very expensive.
But if you reviewed our landmarks, and I think some of the commissioners that's seen some of the presentations, these aren't your run-of-the-mill tract homes that we're presenting as landmarked districts or structures. These are valuable, historic, meaningful homes and areas to the city.
I just want to make sure we don't put blockades so where we can improve those existing communities, that we create the hurdles so high you can't get over them. And that's, I mean, that's
We
my
agree.
fear, and I believe that's what he's been addressing the whole time. So I think we need to try to find some language that will facilitate that. I mean, does everybody agree with that? I mean, is there anything wrong with that?
And maybe just a note that says that not all structures of that age have value.
Because in 10 years when we have this done, all of a sudden those houses are going to be in the 80s.
Yeah.
Jeff, do you think you can come up with language that can put that 50-year mark in proper technical context somehow? And maybe that's.
Sorry, Jeff.
Well, I think we do need to be careful to make sure we're able to review the rest of the chapter as well. And that conversation about infill and housing, all of that will be a huge conversation. And by that third meeting, we'll be a pretty well-oiled machine, hopefully, we'll be able to really get down.
We're happy to review this through that lens, if that's the committee's pleasure.
I was struggling, this has been mentioned, but the difference between the 1.5 and 1.6 of adaptive reuse and the 4.8 of maintaining single-family residences, historic single-family residences as single-family. How do we value both, and how do we balance that?
Yours is 4.6?
4.8.
Where is
Okay,
that?
yeah.
Where is that second one? Like, what's the section?
Sorry, section 4, you're right,
4.
yeah. Section providing financial relief, incentives, and
7
preservation
community
of historic
resources, 8
resources.
historic resources, yeah. Those, I agree, those are in total conflict, and I think,
I'd be more in favor of the adaptive reuse in my mind, but neighborhoods may feel differently about it on a case-by-case basis.
particularly when most of these historically important structures are in close-in neighborhoods to the downtown core where we need multifamily.
And I can tell you that frequently throughout this plan, we have some policies that aren't necessarily in perfect alignment with each other. And looking at development proposals, you have to balance, and you have to look at that. I can tell you specifically this policy was after our first initial set of comments. So we've heard from the community that they want this policy. We haven't heard in terms of this, that this has been an issue with discussion in terms of the public stakeholders, committee members.
So in the context of historic protection, you want the original use to be retained. If it can't, and it goes vacant, you don't want it to be neglected. So you want it to be adapted to whatever use makes sense for that area. So first and foremost, you want the original use, and especially in most of our districts are residential districts, so you want them to remain residential in nature. That's the greatest support to the district. In those cases where you have, some of the homes are very large, and they can't support a single family anymore, that's where we get into some of the adaptive reuse context.
Can we add language, when you're looking at this, can you, maybe we talk about incentives such as ADUs or cottage or added density, so as far as we're adding structures rather than altering homes to add density without manipulating the structure itself?
Are you talking about accessory dwelling units?
Yeah.
Again, isn't that part of our,
Kind of in the works.
And that, so you're adding to 1.5, is what you're saying?
Well, I mean, we're.
Because that was one I was thinking of, was incentives, but whenever we talk about incentives, they're usually monetary, and instead of creating a monetary, we need to have a broader range to give them the ability to make that structure something that's financially stable and viable. And I'm good with that type of encouragement.
Well,
I
it's
mean-
also more realistic.
Mhm.
You know, as an owner of one of these homes, I've sunk 60, 70 grand without hiring contractors, doing a lot of my work myself. A tree's falling on my house and I got a $50,000 foundation bill. How can anybody afford that?
Well, and then 1.8, I don't like 1.8 at all, because I don't like taking funds for evaluation and protection efforts. No, we need to have incentives that move it forward, not producing more cash to try to do a protectionism item. Let's create it so it's a positive instead of a government enforced.
I guess, you know, on the neighborhood perspective, way more tools and arrows in the quiver for homeowners to creatively sustain their property while maintaining some historic character, and less restrictions and less handcuffs on owners to do things to their property that can make them sustainable.
So where does this group think we're at with historic preservation? So let's ask the big question. Are we too much, too little, just right? Where do we sit with historic protection and preservation of our assets?
Just another question first. I'm sorry, I'm gonna need to leave in just a few minutes. I thought the purpose of our meeting was to review the comments from the public. At this stage of the game, we weren't really discussing our own thoughts, I mean, at this point, as much as I agree with some of the things that have been said here. To read these and then and see what has been added to the plan and see if there's anything from here that we feel hasn't been addressed well in the plan. Is that true?
Well, the direction we received to set up was that we would revise the draft plan and give it back to the committee for their review. To supplement that, so your individual thoughts on the plan. To supplement that, we showed you the work we did on the public comment. So, from my perspective, yes, and the members were to have brought their comments and opinions about the plan to the meeting, and over these 3 meetings, you would look at each chapter and direct us appropriately, either individual meetings or at the end, we have this kind of culmination of work product to go back on.
Okay.
But that was the plan.
Okay, so this conversation has been just with you.
Yeah, I think because we don't want to get to the end of this and have members of this board recognize that things have been incorporated, you know, public comments have been incorporated or not, but be sitting with a great deal of heartburn or something that seems like a. On the other hand, we, in order to get our process done and get this out to the public, which is where I think some of these policy and kind of value questions need to be worked out in the public process and in the governing bodies. So we don't want to get bogged down to I mean, we're not here to redo a great deal of what's been done. I think we're here to see if there are any gaping holes or internal, you know, contradictions or things that will trip it up in the process as it's viewed out in the public, that we can hopefully provide something that's ready for public review and governing body deep conversation. So that's why I say on some of these things that are clearly community values, where maybe the community will voice enough dissent or show enough of an impulse to want to add whole sections that aren't there, that can come up from the community conversation and the process. But if we've made some serious mistakes or missed some serious items, it'd be great to fix those before it goes to the public, so we don't open things up for a major, you know. So I guess my concern is just that we be able to move through and get our work done without finding out we have to schedule 3 more meetings before it goes out to the public process.
I think that message is loud and clear. I've made my case for the reasons for my suggestions on adding more incentive for and allowing for multi-use or mixed use or particularly multifamily. I also would suggest we strike 1.9, 2.6, and 4.8. Keep it simple.
John, please keep that succinct summary at hand there.
Okay.
Anything else on historic resources?
My only concern is, I agree with the comments that are being made, is I'm not sure everyone understands, and I agree your explanation of what historic resource is correct, but I'm not sure everyone agrees with your definition of what it is. And to me, with 1.9, if I were on the Historic Resource Commission and I was really in favor of something in particular, this 50-year looks like I could force a group, the city or the county, to do what I wanted it to because of that 50-year terminology in there. And that's not what this document is supposed to do.
People use a lot of policies that way.
I understand that,
Let's not give them the tool.
but hopefully we can eliminate those to a very minor amount.
Okay. We can come back with some options.
All right, shall we move on to parks, recreation, and open space?
And I think this was just some summary points on what was recently adopted by the city of Lawrence, who I would argue has a more formalized Parks and Rec program and department, right? I know the county does Parks and Rec maintenance and has facilities, and we've tried to establish, actually bolster some of what the county is doing here based on some county planning input. But it's primarily based on what we're seeing our Parks Department do.
Was some of this obtained from the master plan for Parks and Rec?
Yeah.
Was it noted that the open space definition changed, the one in the sidebar?
Yeah, do you want to speak to that, Jeff?
Yeah, based on public comment, the open space definition was reset back to active and passive agriculture was pulled out of it based on competing interests in public comment.
Okay. Definition of a floodplain. I'm probably the only fluvial geomorphologist here, so I've got to be the one to point this out. Another aspect of that would be that it is made up of, the soils are made up of river sediment. So, I mean, it's a geologically defined space, not just defined by the city stormwater engineer. So a geologic map would be very informative to where your floodplains are and aren't. Those don't necessarily change with development. That's what the river has laid down. It can also claim in a flood. Put a lot of data to it, but that's still going to be part of, as I evaluate on a planning commission projects coming forward, they say whether or not it is in the floodplain. To me, the floodplain is what it geologically is, not just what the stormwater engineer defines. So I'd like something in terms of river sediment to be part of that definition.
So that definition comes from the National Flood Insurance Program.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not the stormwater engineer, it's the National Flood Insurance Program. So maybe I need a little help with what you're looking to be added to it.
Okay, just geologically, you know, a hill slope is a hill slope, an upland is an upland, a floodplain is a floodplain. that is because it was laid down by the river itself. The sediments came from moving water. That just fundamentally needs to be part of what a floodplain is and how we see it as a community when we're looking at how we use that for development. I can work with you more later.
Well, we use the National Flood Insurance Program in terms of determining floodplain for development. So, are you looking for something else
Something additional that,
than what we currently use?
Well, I think you're saying there's the regulatory floodplain through the National Flood Insurance Program.
Yes.
And then there's the
geographic feature.
geologic definition of floodplain, which can include more about the soils that it
Yes.
lays down. But we go off the mapped, FEMA mapped floodplain areas, whether or not this, independent of what the soil types are with it. And I think that's the distinction that we're talking about, right?
Correct. We would have, I think the better option, if you wanted something added about soils, in specifically, we would have to separate out the FEMA definition, which is what we regulate, versus the other.
Okay. Let me look at it and get back with you.
If we added the geological part of it, then would that in effect change our code definition?
Well, I think that's what we're
I think that's what they're
thinking
trying to
through
prevent.
is,
So that's why we go.
in a land use document, we're trying to keep it constrained
Right.
to what our commissions are.
That's a slippery slope when you start adding other
I don't wanna-
verbiage into what we have said as a federal guideline.
I don't want to create confusion by having one definition for floodplain that includes more than what we have elsewhere. So
Okay.
that was the issue.
Essentially, you stretch the definition and that you're not apples to apples throughout. But yeah, I agree, it'd be nice to know, so.
Well, and that may be one more reason to spend a little bit of time in the section that specifically speaks to soil. I mean, we mention it, we speak around it, but.
We'll get to talk more about that later.
Yes.
I think hold some of this for natural
Hold that
resources.
thought.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so, anything else on the Parks and Rec?
3.4, locate parks, recreation, open space locations near other community facilities such as schools when possible to maximize resources and minimize expenses. I think on the surface that sounds like it makes sense, but if you think about use and how people utilize these kinds of spaces, what I see there is a facility like a school, which is vacant on weekends. So you have this large piece of land vacant on weekends, and then you have large parking lots to accommodate something like that. And then you have these parks that are, say, adjacent to that. So you've got these uses where there's just not a lot of bodies in a long, large piece of land. I'd rather that say something more about parks and open spaces should be adjacent to high-density developments where we have lots and lots of people very close by to reduce as many cars driving as possible. And I don't know how to word that, but the point is that we get the biggest bang for our buck when our open spaces and our parks are adjacent to as many bodies as possible where they live and play, to reduce the impact of cars.
So you're not opposed to what it says, you just want to add
Yes.
that it's.
Could we incorporate that somehow into 3.3? I'm on the new draft. I don't know if that changed.
Yeah, that could
I think that might be a better location
somehow
to add
those things.
Better emphasis on
Two.
the high density.
It just seems crazy, you think about development patterns today compared to where they were 50 or 100 years ago, or European development patterns. We're at the stage where we're creating these large pieces of grass around these homes that we mow, surrounded by concrete, with wide concrete streets and giant concrete driveways and impervious surface. And then we're building parks like the rec center out in the middle of nowhere that we all have to drive to a giant parking lot to go to. And then you think about the efficiency of Central Park, which is one of the most used parks on the planet. It's crazy. So let's break that development pattern.
Better you can be in there, 3.4, you're talking 3.3 covers,
Yeah.
it seems almost redundant.
Maybe.
Usually we had that as a request for school districts, they could, the playground next to parks, and they could use the resources.
That makes sense.
Interchangeably, that was the request of the school district,
Yeah.
So I think it's whether the group thinks that 3.3 covers it, or whether staff could add some language.
You just want to locate them near residential density, is what you're getting at, right?
Yeah, it doesn't say density anywhere. Like, I mean, really, high density should be close to schools, should be close to,
And they also
Yeah, I
must be
think-
consistent with Parks and Rec's master plan.
Well, I think we're assuming that if there's a community facility like a school there, it's serving some amount of population anyway. But
And I
well,
think,
that ties into low-income housing. You have higher density, you have higher multifamily, which is generally more affordable housing, which is people that have less ability to have individual cars. You reduce their transportation costs by putting those facilities next to them. It's all integrated.
and
I just don't think that language is strong enough about our
Okay,
parks.
okay.
All right, are we able to move on to community facilities?
And this is discussing the really governmental facilities and where to locate them and how to maintain them and the construction quality and sustainability of them. And so that's what these goals put forth. We've strengthened or kept, I guess, maintained the support for the community's public general hospital as our last goal under that heading.
Anything, are we good with that? Can we move on to arts and culture?
From a neighborhood perspective, I don't know the solution here, but I think about riding my bicycle through the county sheriff's building every day, through South Park there. And I think about how valuable that real estate is. That could be 1,000 families living in that parking lot and in that building. And instead, it's offices for police officers. And not that police officers don't deserve open space. That's, I think, one of the best lots in all of Lawrence, Kansas. And we've reserved it for a hyper-private public entity that the public very rarely gets to
Well, that's
see.
also where the courts are, the
I
officers
know.
of the courts and all of that. But
That's
I
not the
agree,
best use of that
It's an
land.
incredibly valuable parcel for,
From parking cop cars, actually cops' personal cars, so they can get into their cop car. I don't know how we inject that into here, but that's not where corporate,
That's
that's not where
pretty-
those facilities should be.
It's a pretty specific issue for this level of the,
yeah.
Well, same thing with this building. This building is blocking off the physical connection to the river to downtown. These are really poor site.
yet we also have a public
Yeah.
overlook for the river upstairs.
That's
It
absolutely.
encourages me to come down here.
Yeah.
I'm down here quite often, right?
Here's my point. Here's my point. We've made mistakes over the last 50 years in locating very important public facilities on tracts of land that could be benefiting the general public on a much more regular and frequent basis. I don't know if the language in here addresses that, those past mistakes.
You know, I can't say past mistakes, because keep in mind, that's a centralized location for law enforcement. You start talking to the county about where we put things and what we do, and, you know, you talk about travel, and that's one of the traveling points. I mean, there's hundreds of them every day. So don't characterize it all as bad.
I think we can all acknowledge that communities evolve and choices that were good
Sure.
choices a while back are
Sure.
now.
Yeah.
They seem like bad choices,
Yeah.
and they probably are as they're located now.
Yeah.
So
Right.
I think we're not gonna solve that problem right now, but,
Oh, come on.
so,
Nancy.
how about
Arts and culture.
Arts and culture.
This was really just a recap of the adopted citywide cultural plan. That's why it's fairly brief. And so where this is sort of urban heavy, I think the last one under here, the food systems development, which adopts the county food systems plan, is maybe more rural heavy. but could have implications, both of these, for each other. But again, these were recent plans that went through a very public process and came out with an approval, so it's more or less just referencing them by, incorporating them by reference. So we've got some stuff to chew on with the resources chapter. Let me just, while we've got a few minutes, draw your attention to the appendix. A lot of the appendix is demographic community profile in section A. And then we go on to section B is where we're incorporating our existing land use plans, whether they be large sector plans, corridor plans, neighborhood plans, transportation plans. So these are all plans that are adopted today and may be revised based on what we're doing in this in the future. So that's one of the big distinctions between Horizon 2020 and this plan. The reason we can be abbreviated in our chapters up front is because we're doing so much work in our sector plans and neighborhood plans that show up in your appendix. And then section D is implementation. And this is where we have taken, anytime there's sort of an action step or a potential code change or something that we have to do to implement the plan, we've put it back under implementation. And we've tried to, so on page 98, under implementation, we've given you example, right under chapter 2, growth and development, you'll see B, we've pulled over policy 1.3. This is an example of how this will be set up. The policy is create zoning regulations to provide guidance and protection of the county's historic unincorporated towns. I had to choose that one. We will provide a status in the plan, whether it's not initiated, completed, in progress, determined not to be pursued, and then give it a date. We are obligated by state statute to provide an update to the Planning Commission every year on how we're implementing our plan. We see this as our main tool for doing that. So as we create work plans and then implement and bring codes, this becomes our running tally of what we've done. And that is the bulk of the appendix. That is the appendix.
So we have just a very few minutes. Did anyone bring any particular concern to the appendix? I was so glad to see really well developed and nicely organized demographics and charts and I thought the way it was laid out made some sense. I'm wondering if we need to add the county's survey of the natural Kelly Kincher's.
Biological.
That hasn't been necessarily formally adopted by everybody, so any discussion on the appendix? Because we promised Michael the opportunity to speak. I think you're going to have about 3 minutes because we have swarms of people wanting to come in. Any other comments from the group? Okay.
I would have liked to have seen a section added to local foods called neighborhood food production. And just to highlight some quick things, something supporting neighborhood gardens, something supporting individuals growing food in their own property. And then particularly for infill for close-in neighborhoods, there's a lot of public land, like the strips between the sidewalk and the street, that could actually be gardened. We can have some policies that encourage that behavior.
I think they have, isn't it, the urban egg?
Kind of, it's just not really talked about here.
I think that's also referenced in the Food Policy Council's food plan,
Yep.
where
Yeah.
adopted by reference.
The title page alternatives, can we leave that for next time? And then, so that we honor the need to get out of here in just 3 minutes, Michael, are you able to say what you need to say in just 3 minutes? I'm sorry, we didn't really plan on full public discussion.
Yeah, I think I can.
Okay.
If I could, There. And how do I close this down?
And I don't usually do a shot clock, but I really am.
Up here? There.
No, it's all good. It's all good, but we just.
We get Dawn the laminate card. 1 minute, 30 seconds, so it comes in 0, which should hold up during school board meetings.
We have an actual time clock.
While Michael's getting ready, just maybe a reminder to go through the chapter and bring up more comments that you might have for, that's why we've given you which chapters we're gonna look at in April here. So,
And I think having done this once now together,
Now we
this
kinda
next
get-
time
get
we'll
everything
kind of know how to pace ourselves. Okay.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Commissioner Feldman. I'll try and be brief. My name is Michael Allman, and in October I submitted a letter from Sustainability Action Network specifically about map 2.1, but there are other information included in this letter, 4-page letter that staff reduced to 2 sentences in your comments. So you didn't get the gist of what we submitted.
the whole letter was posted, Michael?
So what the point of my letter is, which, you know, I also mentioned that it would be much stronger document if the 377 shalls from the existing Horizon 2020 were not reduced to only 24 in this document. It's not just that it's all electronically accessible, so it can be much briefer document. It's much weaker. But the example that I use in my letter has to do with this map. That green area in Plan 2040 population growth, that's Tier 2 for annexation. The map on the right is Transportation 2040, the exact same map, although that's a better one because it shows where the Wakarusa River is, whereas the Plan 2040 map doesn't even show the river. It's hard to even tell where that geologic or regulatory floodplain is. That's a poor map, very poor map. The problem is this is designated for annexation. 3.0, annexation into Lawrence, require development contiguous to city limits to annex and develop to urban standards. Within Tier 2, Tier 2 is planned and expected to urbanize. In 5.0, as Tier 2 develops, protect and preserve natural environmental features and sensitive lands in that kind of an area that is designated for annexation. A community benefit may include, and this is one example, it should be shall include, preservation of significant amounts of environmentally sensitive lands above that minimally required by code, which will be in the appendix, right? The codes are all in the appendix. So sensitive lands include floodway and floodplain, high-quality agricultural soils, wetlands, and stream corridors. All of that is in that green area designated for annexation and urbanization. Lawrence, for the last 5, 6, 8 years, has been moving away, Lawrence and Douglas County, thanks to Commissioner Thellman and the Chamber of Commerce, from industrial and commercial development in the floodplain and the 100-year regulatory floodplain and the wetlands. Okay.
You got 10 seconds.
North Lawrence Airport Industrial Park, backed off of. East Hills Business Park, east of Noria Road, backed off and de-annexed. This area is under pursuit by a developer to develop. It should be removed from that map. It should not be urbanized. So,
Okay, so I would say that that's a public comment that will be very valuable.
and
as
that will
this
be on
goes.
April 16th.
Yeah,
That's-
so let's
kind of a
save any
special-
further comments
Yeah.
about that.
I just
for
wanted to
that.
get that
Yeah,
in there so that you realize what my comments were
yeah.
in October. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. All right, I think with that, we are ahead by a few minutes, and so I would move to adjourn. Right? Can I?
Second?
Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Oh, All right, thank you all so much, and you new folks, thank you.